how do you know when sickness may have a spiritual root?
You
So
know,
I'm Drew Kellerman. Today we're going to be talking with Beatty Carmichael to help us recognize when there may be more going on than just the physical symptoms.
yeah, it's real interesting, Drew. I find that most sicknesses actually do have a spiritual root. And I know this because as I've tested through this process of how to release the spiritual roots, I find most sicknesses disappear. I'm not saying that everything has a spiritual root, but a whole lot of people of issues do. And as I get into that, I want to share a friend of mine named Steve to bring him up and just kind of have him share what he's finding with the same process. So, Steve, take it away.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Beatty. I'm just going to share a quick story. I hadn't come across the Prayer of Freedom. One day I was just scanning through YouTube and I came across a clip, and Beatty was sharing about forgiveness and how that can be linked into sickness. And it was really bizarre because at that same time, a migraine headache, and I'd had migraines, I've probably had them for over 40 years, and suddenly it just started to come on, which I thought was really bizarre, really unusual. And so after I finished watching the clip, I took some of the teachings, some of the learnings, and I had a prayer, and I forgave my parents for some bitterness that I didn't even know that I'd been harboring. And the whole side of my face went all tingly. The migraine headache just disappeared, and and I was healed. It was incredible. And I mean, I had migraines from like I would get them from dairy products, from eggs. If I ate an egg, I would get a migraine headache probably within half an hour. So after I had this experience, I tested it, cooked up 3 eggs on the barbecue, no migraine headache, and it was fascinating. The other interesting component was it did try to come back on about 2 occasions. And what I hadn't realized is on the occasions was I'd actually slipped back into some conversations with some family members, and some bitterness had started to come. And then that night, the migraine came back again.
Wow.
I confessed it instantly. It just went again. And I've been for over 3 months now, healed from migraine headaches, and I am sold out for Jesus and what he did on the cross, and so excited about following up on the prayer of freedom because it works and it's awesome.
That's so great. Thank you for sharing that, Steve. And in fact, one thing that, as Steve was sharing on this, one of the things that happened recently is I was at the Addiction Recovery Center where I teach. And one of the things that there was a lady there, and I was going through the prayer of freedom with them, guiding them through the process. And she was brand new to the class, and she was telling me that, I find it so difficult. In fact, I find it almost impossible to believe that you can have lifetime issues, and all you do is you say a few words, like what happened with Steve. I forgive so and so, okay, or I confess that something was wrong. She said, I can't believe that anything like that would ever work because it's just words. And words can't stop or reverse what's been going on for years. So her name is Angel. I asked her name. It's actually Angel. I love the name. So I said, well, Angel, let me ask you a question. Do you have any pain or anxiety that has been with you for years? She says, yeah, I got both of them. I said, which one do you want to test? Let me just show you how this works. And she said, my back pain. It's horribly painful, and I've had it for decades now, and I like to see that thing go away. Okay, great. So I led her through the simple process of the prayer of freedom, which is simply engaging with God to identify where something may be wrong that's spiritually out of alignment in your life with Him, and then asking Him to remove whatever that pain or that issue is. In 3 minutes, or maybe it was 4, I actually pulled out my stopwatch and I said, look, I'm going to show you in 3 minutes, maybe 4, it's going to be gone. And within that 4-minute time frame, but I think it was 3, all of her back pain was gone. All she did is the same thing that Steve did, is she confessed something. Isn't that cool, Drew?
You know, that's amazing, but it sounds like she came at this as a skeptic. She
Yeah.
she wasn't real sure. So how did it work with her saying the words as a skeptic?
You know what's interesting? So think about this. If sickness has spiritual roots, okay, let's start with that premise. If it has spiritual roots, then the question is, how did those roots get there? And whatever got them there, all you do is reverse what put them there, and then it disappears. And I find that a lot of times simply what puts them there, here's kind of the bigger picture. God has developed, when God created man, he put a conscience in our heart. And that conscience guides us in right or wrong. And when we do something wrong, it convicts us. And we're ideally are supposed to turn away from what's wrong. To repent of it is basically kind of a Bible text, is to turn away from it. If we did something wrong, just to confess that we did wrong and to not do it again. But what really happens, Drew, is when we resist that and we push back on and we say, no, I'm not going to obey you, conscience, because you don't realize what that person did and how bad they hurt me. And now the conscience kind of says, okay, I'm just not going to remind you anymore. And so now we can start to do things and it doesn't bother us as much. But it's still a spiritual root and it's tied into that activity that we did. So when we go back and basically say, I confess that I was wrong on that item. And that's the simplistic concept. There's a little bit more to it, which is the reason for the book, The Prayer of Freedom. But when you do that, those words have power. The same type of power is as if you're in a courtroom and the judge says, how do you plead? You go, guilty or not guilty. Words have power because whatever words you say will determine right then the outcome of what's going to happen with that court session. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It's a concept that makes sense in that, of course, words have power. We understand that, and idle words we try to stay away from. But so what you're saying, though, is that even if you don't necessarily fully believe it in your heart, you don't have it deeply embedded in an emotion behind what you're saying, by saying the words out loud, by whatever the process is you took Angel through, that work, that had efficacy.
Yeah, and this was the big thing that she was having trouble with. She said, I don't believe this. I said, well, you don't have to believe it, you just have to do it. But I understand that you want to believe it, so you will do it, right? That was the issue with her. And that was the whole purpose of that simple demonstration. I was sharing with her that, this is just a microcosm of what the bigger process of the prayer of freedom is, but you can pinpoint it to just that one item. I said, if we did that with your anxiety, the anxiety would be gone too. In fact, let me share something that happened. This gives you a bigger picture of what's going on. I was up on the prayer line at my church several months ago, and this guy came up and he said, will you pray for me? I have anxiety and it's tearing me up. And actually said, well, you came to the right person because anxiety is easy to get rid of. That's not what the professionals will tell you, but that's been my experience. And he shared that about 6 months earlier, he had gone to the doctor, and the doctor said, you got anxiety, and it's going to now be with you the rest of your life, so let's get you on meds. That's the medical community's approach. But I said, anxiety usually has a root. And anxiety is constant fear. And that means that the root of it is probably fear somewhere down the line. So I simply asked him, I said, how long have you had anxiety? He said, about 1.5 years. I said, well, what happened about 1.5 years ago that made you terribly afraid? He thought, and he said, my wife had a breast exam and they found lumps. And I became terribly afraid. I said, well, that's your problem. You're holding on to that fear. So I guided him in the process, just like I did with Angel, to release that fear. All it was, we say it's only words, but words carry power in the spiritual realm. And when he released that fear and asked God to remove that anxiety, it was gone. He was so astounded. He's great big old guy. He gave me this huge big bear hug. He was literally crying because the relief was so big, so powerful.
Well, that's amazing, and it's surprising because I guess so. The concept is that even as an adult, some action or some feeling or some belief or some something we shouldn't be doing, if we feel a certain way or do a certain thing, that could trigger the beginning of a physical sickness or a mental illness or an emotional issue, even. So not doesn't have to go back to childhood or
Right.
way back when.
Yeah. So if you think about, and this is the question that you're asking is, how do you know when a sickness has a spiritual root? And what I was just trying to share with these stories is when you just do something to release something in the spirit. So your conscience is in the spiritual realm, right? It's, our makeup is we're mental, physical, and spiritual. So, and we know our conscience isn't mental. It's not up here. It's not physical. It's something else. It's not mental or physical. So it's spiritual. And when I guide people to simply release what's in that spiritual side of things that are out of alignment with God's design for life, the Bible calls it sin. It's not like, oh, I'm so ashamed. Sin is missing the mark of God's standard. That's all it is. And when you just address that issue, then I find that these sicknesses will frequently go away. And the real way to know if your sickness has a spiritual root is simply to try the spiritual process. My father-in-law, he's been deceased now for almost 25 years, but he was an internal medicine doc for 50 years. So that puts you back in the older, mid-1900s and through that time frame. And he had incredible success with his patients. And he would bring every patient into his office and he would diagnose them. He would say, health is based on mental, physical, and spiritual. So let's talk about what's going on. And he's listening for cues to say, is this a mental, a physical, or a spiritual issue? And he had tremendous success. Most of the items were tied somewhere in spiritually. But what's happening in our healthcare now is we only deal with mental and physical. We have lost the spiritual. And that's why we see these persistent sicknesses. And so the way that my father-in-law would confirm the diagnosis is he said, I think this is this problem, so let's try the remedy that solves that problem. And if that remedy works, then I know the diagnosis was right. So back to how do you know if a sickness has a spiritual root? First try the spiritual root process. And if that gets rid of it, then you know the root was spiritual and it wasn't mental or physical. Is this making sense?
Yeah, that absolutely does. We had a good question come in from our audience, very related to this. If there is no spiritual root to the sickness, can it still, if it's a natural sickness, can it still be healed through this process?
No. So, the prayer of freedom handles spiritual roots. And if the root is not spiritual, it doesn't touch it at all. Just like maybe a medicinal process, let's say antibiotics handles a bacterial root. I think that's the right term. But it's not going to handle it if you have a broken bone because it's a wrong remedy for a wrong issue. Same thing with the prayer of freedom. It's only for spiritual. But the good news is if you have anything that's been persistent in life, that's persistent pain, persistent sickness, persistent mental problems, persistent relationship issues. In almost all cases, I'm finding about a 90% success rate with people getting free of those things. So one of the things I like to suggest is, as you're watching this, just add a comment. What stood out with this? Give me a comment. Let us know if you're dealing with some sort of sickness and still searching for answers. And let us know on that. And you can learn more about the Prayer of Freedom at theprayerofreedombook.com, where you can get more details on how this process works. Thanks and be blessed.